James Broughton was many things. One of the most important was that he was a pagan and a poet, and he believed in the image and the idea of freedom in a way that not that many people believe. Experimental film in the context of all of cinema, I suppose the most concise way to describe it is that experimental film is more like poetry than prose, in that the Hollywood narrative commercial film tends to be based on narrative models, whereas experimental film, avant-garde film, has more of the poetic dimension than the narrative dimension. It doesn't mean there aren't narratives in experimental cinema, but they more frequently they have a poetic dimension, which is not that frequent to commercial film, although that doesn't mean commercial film isn't poetic either. It's just a little bit more of one than the other. The evolution of experimental film in America is very interesting. It started in the 1920s and continued in the 30s, when it was largely, the word experimental usually included documentary as well, but it was almost always concentrated in the East Coast by semi-professional documentary filmmakers. There were experimental films being made on the West Coast, but it was done under the aegis of cinematographers and some directors who were working in the industry, the Hollywood industry. And they were usually making films in 35 millimeter. World War II came along and transformed the situation, because 16 millimeter cameras became available through surplus, through war surplus in 1945-46, and it was possible at that point to get equipment really inexpensively, 16 millimeter equipment. Now 16 millimeter had existed already from the late 1920s. It was designed to be a home movie format. This is before 8 millimeter came out. In the early 1940s, even the early 1940s, because even before the war ended, many of these cameras wound up in the surplus market. It was possible to buy a good quality 16 millimeter camera for use by an individual. The Whitney brothers, as I said before, made their films with this kind of a camera. And Kenneth Anger, for instance, shot his film Fireworks, before Fireworks, he shot films on 16 millimeter with the Cine Kodak camera that was widely available then on the home movie market. By 1949, it was possible to buy a Bolex camera as well, and though that level of equipment made it possible for filmmakers to work with confidence with good quality equipment. You never knew if a gun camera was actually going to work well, and they were always trying to sell the people who bought gun camera film, which was cruddy, and almost nobody of any integrity or high aspiration used gun camera film until the making of Flaming Creatures by Jack Smith, who deliberately used low quality gun camera film in shooting that film. Because of the prevalence of this equipment on the West Coast, suddenly a number of filmmakers began working there, and they were able to make films freely and inexpensively. I think I've mentioned Kenneth Anger, Gregory Markopoulos, Curtis Harrington, and numerous others. And of course, one of the hugely important developments was the opening of the Art in Cinema series, where there was a place where the films could be shown. Harry Smith started out as a assistant to the man who ran Art in Cinema, and then began making his own films. This was the case with many other people like Chester Kessler and Maya Deren. They all found in Art in Cinema, the exhibition series, a doorway to public visibility and a doorway to meeting other filmmakers. And the whole West Coast environment changed because of the availability of the equipment and the availability of an exhibition organization. Sadly, Art in Cinema died in 1954 when the man who ran Art in Cinema died, and you don't have the reappearance of an ambitious exhibition series until 1961 when Canyon Cinema is founded. There had been an attempt previously to start a film exhibition series by Lawrence Jordan and Bruce Conner, but running such a series takes a lot of time and energy, and they had other things to do. They were making films. Their series did not survive very long. It only lasted about 5 years. Well, James is interesting because, first of all, he began making films at a time when there wasn't much of an experimental film movement in the United States. There had been in Europe. And furthermore, he came to film from a background in poetry. So he had a natural inclination to the poetic dimension of cinema that, say, John Ford, well, John Ford is poetic too, but Orson Welles did not make films that were particularly poetic. They were visually extraordinary, but poetry, except when he was working off of Shakespeare, was something relatively unusual for him. Broughton brought his poetic background, and furthermore, Broughton's subjects tended to be short and more open to the kind of poetic resonance that one might find in written poetry as opposed to written narratives. Also, Broughton, more than many people, had a comic side to him. Broughton's films are fun, and they are funny, and that's present from the very beginning of his films. Well, not the very beginning, but The Adventures of Jimmy, certainly. Sally Dixon was doing a film series at Carnegie Institute, at the Museum of Art in Carnegie Institute in Pittsburgh, and Broughton was one of the first filmmakers who came to Pittsburgh for an in-person screening. I believe it was in 1970 or maybe 1971. I'm not precisely sure. But he was introducing and answering questions about his films. And I had a habit. I was always curious. I should say that I had discovered experimental film about 10 years earlier, specifically through Bruce Conner, seeing Bruce Conner's films. And when Broughton's films were shown, I was full of questions. So I was the first person to ask a question, as I was at most of the screenings. And I thought Broughton was delightful, that he was irreverent, but he took film very seriously, and to me that was important. So I met him at these screenings that Sally Dixon was doing in Pittsburgh in 1970 or 71. And he then came back to Pittsburgh virtually every year for the next 4 to 5 years. So I got to see him a great deal. I was also making photographs. I was a photographer, and I made a point of photographing every filmmaker who struck me as being at all interesting. Broughton, because he was very interesting, I photographed him repeatedly, both at the lectern and then in press conferences that press interviews that Sally would set up in her office and at Carnegie Institute. And some of those pictures of James were, I think, very good, and I think James felt the same way. At first, I didn't have any interactions. I was a bit shy, and it's one thing to ask questions in an auditorium with a lot of people around you. It's another to asking questions in when there's only 5 people for one of these press interviews. But I had most of my answers already at that time. I mean, I had most of the answers to the questions I was wondering about at that time. But I liked his film so much that I think on the second encounter with him, I said to him that I could make still photographs, stills from his films, if he would like, and that I didn't really want money for them, but I would like to swap a bunch of still photographs for a film once I had made enough of those photographs. He made an autobiographical film where he was backlit by the sun, and I recognized immediately that it would be very amenable to being photographed off the screen, which I did, and I was able to produce really good still images of that moment in the film. I sent James a stack of, I think, 10 to 15 prints, and a year or two later, I began seeing these images, my photographs, appearing everywhere James had a show, either in the press coverage or in the publicity before the shows. So my photographs turned out to be very useful to him. And it was clear to me that if I could be useful to him, it would be, he would be more likely to do a swap, which he did. I don't really know. Jonas, of course, didn't get to the United States until 1949. James had been in England. And then Jonas was on the East Coast and James was on the West Coast. So my suspicion is that they didn't meet until James had a screening at like Cinema 16 or at the Museum of Modern Art. But I don't think the Museum of Modern Art had him often before the 1960s. After the 1960s, it was a different situation. Jonas was an important figure on the East Coast because he had a column in the Village Voice and because he was the editor of Film Culture. And at that point, he had become the most prominent, if I can put it this way, print journalist involved with the avant-garde. His film work had not really made it that much of an impression by 1961, 62. It was up to me to say who was the father of West Coast cinema. I would say Oscar Fischinger, because Fischinger had such an enormous influence on many other people before James was making films. James occupied a unique place in American experimental film. He would do seminars in Pittsburgh about that, and he would talk about how Maya Deren was the grandmother of all American avant-garde filmmakers. And somebody in the audience said, well, who's the grandfather? And I think he said, well, it might have been me. But he didn't stress that. He was somewhat modest. Outrageous, but modest. But he may well have said that he was the father or the grandfather of West Coast film. And in terms of the East Coast, Willard Moss, who was an irascible father or grandfather. On the West Coast, James was an inspirational figure because he was making films at a time when very few people did, and because he was an acknowledged, established poet, and because of his generosity of spirit. So in that respect, he was a father figure to a generation of filmmakers. But in that sense, Oscar Fischinger was a father figure as well. And the two of them were, I suppose, the grandfathers, plural, of West Coast cinema. That's my opinion. Well, when James started making films after 1945, there was relatively little activity in the United States. The Whitney brothers were making their experimental films with a sound pendulum in Los Angeles. Kenneth Anger was soon to make Fireworks in 1948. Broughton and Sidney Peterson was teaching filmmaking, and Broughton, I'm not sure when he made The Adventures of Jimmy. He made a film with Peterson in 46, and soon after began making films alone. He ceased making films in collaboration with anybody for 3 decades practically. And he was the leading figure on the West Coast in terms of making films, which is why he would be called the grandfather or the father of West Coast cinema. And there were a few other films being made at that time by Lawrence Jordan, and after 1959 by Bruce Conner. But at the time, Broughton was one of the most prominent figures, particularly because he had gone to England in the early 50s to make a film. That was unusual. Broughton and Peterson jointly made The Potted Psalm in 1947 or 48, and that was the beginning of a whole series of films that Peterson made at the California School of the Arts, I think was the name of the institution. Broughton went off and began making his own films, specifically The Adventures of Jimmy, and then a number of films in the 1950s. He was a model. He was a model for people to make films, a model of someone who had made films and continued. Peterson stopped in 1951 or 50 or 1951, so he wasn't really a model. In fact, he was no longer on the West Coast. He moved back to the East. But James stayed on the West Coast, and people looked up to him. Not always as the person to imitate. I mean, Lawrence Jordan wasn't imitating James, but I'm sure he felt inspired by him. And Bruce Conner was making films on his own initiative in 1958 onwards. But James was a kind of rock that people could look to as a poet and a filmmaker, an artist who was active in both areas. And that was very important in the San Francisco area because, of course, the Beats were in San Francisco, and Broughton would fit in that environment also. Mother's Day was one of his earlier films, and I frankly did not like it. It was full of an animus against mothers similar to that Alfred Hitchcock had. Hitchcock always had his mothers doing something unpleasant, like stuffing out a cigarette in an egg yolk. Broughton could have done something like that if Hitchcock hadn't already done it. But I don't remember the film. I don't tend to think a lot about films that don't excite my admiration. Well, when James started making films after 1945, well, in the late 40s, early 50s, you had several different art movements. I've already mentioned the Beats. In the East and then in the West, you had abstract expressionism. I can't really speak to the subject of poetry. I just know that James was an active poet. not just an active poet, he was a funny poet. I keep using the word funny, but James was a lot of fun to be around. And his poetry snapped, crackled, and popped. And it rhymed. It wasn't blank verse, I think is the right term to use. So it was an exciting period, particularly on the West Coast. I mean, in the East Coast, you had abstract expressionism. But on the West Coast, you had filmmaking and poetry and the beats. And there was a lot of interesting painting going on as well, but much of that painting was done by immigrants who had come to the United States during World War II and then wound up on the West Coast. I think Man Ray was there until the early 1950s, and many others were there as well. I'm still learning about that period, about the immigrant artists. An obvious example was Oscar Fischinger, who was active, who was an inspiration to many filmmakers, even though he stopped making films in 1948 because he didn't have the backing for it. So Oscar fell back on his painting work, which is glorious. But Oscar inspired Kenneth Anger and Curtis Harrington and Gregory Markopoulos, all of whom were rising out of that West Coast stew, if I can put it that way. And they all broke into high visibility in the 1950s, particularly through the Art and Cinema film series that Frank Stoffaker was running from 1947 or 48 onwards. I don't think they were seen much to begin with. The only outlet on the East Coast in the 1950s was Cinema 16, and Amos Vogel tended to show a film once, and then he didn't show it again. And James' cinematic output was not that great in the 1950s. I mean, he would make a film that would be shown, and then he didn't have a follow-up. I mean, he didn't make a film every year. Very few avant-garde filmmakers did. You had to be financially comfortable. Ian Hugo made films almost every year, but he was a banker, and he had access to money, his own. James didn't have access to money unless he was funded by the British Film Institute to make the film that he had made in England. And it was a different environment in both cases. Someone like Lawrence Jordan was able to make many films, but Lawrence made very short films for the most part, and James tended to want to make longer films, particularly in this period. I think he was popular in Europe because people didn't know much about him and because his films were enjoyable. They weren't serious meditations on the aftermath of World War II. They were playful. And that made a big difference, I think, to European film festivals. And also, of course, they were exotic. American experimental cinema was a surprising development that people had not anticipated. I've been working with other filmmakers from that period whose work was gobbled up by the Europeans because it was different. And because it wasn't, I'm not serious, but it wasn't morbid the way many of the Italian and Belgian and French films were. Well, Cocteau gave an award to the Pleasure Garden, just as several years earlier he had given an award and praised Kenneth Anger's Fireworks. That, of course, was a huge honor. Cocteau was perceived in America as a major figure, as an artist. His films weren't that well known in this country, except by the filmmakers. And of course, in that respect, that was like the ultimate achievement. To be praised by Cocteau was a bigger deal than to be praised by Duchamp for a filmmaker. When Cocteau praised The Pleasure Garden, it certainly excited and pleased James, but The Pleasure Garden was a long film, and I think it was shot in 35 millimeter. And James didn't have the resources to keep making films in 35 millimeter or long films. So while it made him happy, I don't know that it was something that he was able to follow up on. After The Pleasure Garden, there's an interregnum that doesn't resume until he makes The Bed in 1967. But then, of course, that's the most spectacular comeback that one could have made, to go from The Pleasure Garden to The Bed. Well, the big thing about The Bed, I know with audiences, was the nudity. Broughton had more nudity in that film than anything you could see in America at that time. And it was also, as I said before, very playful. It was a lighthearted movie that evoked something that was common to everybody. I mean, everybody sleeps in a bed. We spend a third of our lives in bed. James made a film that dealt with what much of it seemed to be like dreams in a bed. It was also very tangible. You had men and women and children without clothes in a bed, which is not unusual. And it was fun. I keep using that phrase, but that word, but that defines James. In fact, if James had a middle initial and it was James F. Broughton, the F probably would be for fun. I enjoyed it immensely. I mean, of James's films, Dreamwood was the second big excitement for me when James made it. Dreamwood evoked Greek legends. It evoked myths of a persuasive and at an important level. And by that time, I had known James. That's the film that I did the still photograph from. And it was a terrific experience to know the man who made this wonderful film. Well, I was making photographs for him, and he was using them, and I finally asked him if I could buy a print of the film of Dreamwood at cost, at lab cost, so he wouldn't be out anything, but so that I could have it for use in my classes, because I was teaching film by that time at Pittsburgh Filmmakers. And James said, sure. He had a print that was not perfect. It was missing one shot that he had decided to add later on, but he didn't know what to do with this 99% complete version of the film. And he said, I could sell you that for lab cost. And I said, done. So I got a print of Dreamwood, and I used it every semester as an example of poetry, cinema, and myth. Dreamwood for me was a marvelous film evoking Western culture, if I can put it that way. That's a kind of exaggeration. I mean, it's not an exaggeration. It's about a descent into myth and also a descent into the mind. It's I don't know that it's Freudian, but it has the feel of an analytic core sample of what is beneath the human experience in the 20th century. Well, Brakhage was one of the people, Stan Brakhage was one of the people who had been inspired by James. Brakhage started making films in the mid-1950s in Colorado, began traveling back and forth to the West Coast in particular, and James was an inspiration in a lot of ways. Stan never talked to me about James other than in the most reverential terms. He thought James was wonderful. And I know that when he taught at the Art Institute, he would always include James's films. They were important to Brakhage in several ways. One of them was that James was a poet and used poetry in his films. Brakhage was, in his own eyes, a failed poet. He had wanted to write poetry, never did to his own satisfaction. There must be Brakhage poetry, but it's hard to find, if it survived. Whereas James was publishing poetry all along, and in fact, at the time that he was not making films, in the late 50s, early 60s, he was publishing poetry and books. So he had a presence then, and he was an active inspiration for people like Brakhage, particularly because Brakhage wanted to be a poet. Brakhage's significance in the avant-garde film world is hard to overestimate. He later became an inspiration to other filmmakers, latching on to ideas that he got from Marie Menken and Ian Hugo and others, particularly first-person cinema. From 1958 onwards, Brakhage's films involved the camera embodying the filmmaker's presence as well as his vision. Before that, Brakhage made what were called psychodramas. They were somewhat different. I don't think you could call James's films psychodramas, but Brakhage was a huge figure. And when James got married, Stan was the cameraman who shot the footage that became Nuptia. Well, Anthology got started, officially launched December 1st, 1970. That's when it was launched for the public. Before it opened, a committee was formed to select what were felt to be the 200 to 300 most important films in terms of the evolution of the art of cinema. Many of James's films were included in that collection. And there was some friction in the committee about what would be selected. James was not part of that. James was not considered a controversial figure to include in that collection. But at that time, James was not a member of the collection committee, the Essential Cinema Collection. Stan Brakhage had been an initial member of the committee. He became unhappy with the selection process, which had started off being a unanimous procedure, and after the selection of 40 or 50 films, they no longer had unanimous agreements, and Brakhage walked out of the selection process. There was then an attempt made to get a replacement from somewhere other than New York, because most of the committee members were from New York itself. They tried to get Bruce Bailey, and Bruce Bailey said no. And they then approached Broughton and asked him if he would serve on the committee, and James said yes. Now, by this time, his films were already selected, so there was no conflict of interest for James. He was not in a position, he did not have to recuse himself or whatever when his films came up because they were already in the collection. But James was always in an awkward position because he was on the West Coast and everybody else was on the East Coast, so that when they would have a committee meeting, it was necessary to fly James to New York for the meetings. In terms of the Essential Cinema Collection, James was in complete agreement with the project and the selection. So there was no controversy for him in that respect. He felt honored to participate in it. And it was a really singular project. The idea that a core collection of films that defined the evolution of the art of cinema could exist and could be visible. There was, of course, a collection of films that the Museum of Modern Art showed on a regular cycle, their history of film. But it included many films of marginal interest, but that the museum had simply acquired. It also included many extraordinary films. But the anthology project of the Essential Cinema Collection was shocking to many people. This was a collection of films with no titles by John Ford, no titles by Akira Kurosawa. And in 1970, Kurosawa was at the height of his visibility. Instead, the Essential Cinema Collection had films by Yasujiro Ozu, who was almost totally unknown in the United States at the time. In fact, it's because Ozu films were included in the anthology cycle that Dan Talbot at the New Yorker Films began acquiring the rights to Ozu films so that they could be seen elsewhere. But anthology had films that you couldn't see elsewhere. It wasn't just that Ozu became available after anthology opened and hadn't been visible before. It was that you could not see the Dolly Buñuel films. Un Chien Andalou you could see easily, but the L'Âge d'Or could not be seen in America unless you visited one of the three archives that held that film. Pacific Film Archive in the West Coast, George Eastman House in the East, and the Museum of Modern Art. When anthology began showing L'Âge d'Or, it was a major breakthrough, particularly if you lived in New York City. You didn't have to travel to Eastman House in Rochester to see the film, which is what I had to do when I was in Pittsburgh in 1970 and 71. I didn't have the resources to come to New York to see the film here, but I was able to take a class to Eastman House, and we saw that film there. If you tried to ship that film and the post office discovered it, it would be confiscated. So it was a different world at that time. It was perceived to be obscene. It was perceived to be scandalous, an insult to the church. And at this time, the Legion of Decency was still an important factor in determining what was acceptable. You have to remember that it wasn't until 1968 or so that you have the first major Hollywood films that did not bend in front of the Legion of Decency. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was a film that was condemned, I believe, for what it showed in the language used by Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. There's a period of a hazy period from like 1965 until 1973 when censorship was still a factor in the United States. And Broughton's films could easily have fallen afoul of that as well. The Bed certainly. And in New York, you had a double problem. It was not just the U.S. Post Office, but there was a censorship board here in the city. And the city would not allow certain films to be shown at commercial houses. The reason why Amos Vogel started Cinema 16 was to escape the restrictions of censorship. When Anthology got started, I always was puzzled by that because you had to pay to get into Anthology, and it was not a membership organization. But Anthology was showing films that previously only Amos Vogel had been able to show as a nonprofit. How they got around that, I don't really know, but there were a series of major legal cases at the time in which Jonas Mekas, among others, was hailed into court for showing films that were perceived to be obscene or pornographic, like Jean Genet's. There were other films. Censorship was falling in bits and pieces around the country. By 1974, it was gone. But nobody thinks about that now. We don't have a problem with that. Everybody's used to a film may be released with an X rating, but that doesn't mean you can't go to see it. It just means you're not supposed to take your toddlers with you or whatever. James Broughton was in a interesting position in that when he started to make films, censorship and rules of decorum were such that you could not, you should not, and usually did not show naked bodies or sexual activity. And this existed up through the 1960s. In the 1970s, that all begins to change. And when it did, Broughton himself was able to do things on film that he was not able to do previously. The film that I wound up getting credit for producing, actually I deserve the credit for producing, Erogyny, involves nude male and female bodies. It involves close-ups of breasts and all parts of the human body. That film that was made shot in 75 and released in 1976 probably could not have been made in the 1960s. That kind of film is the kind of thing that would have been seized by the censors. James was liberated by the fall of censorship, and you see more and more nudity, more and more sexual allusions and actual sexual activity in his films from the mid-1970s onward. I mean, there is what I would call discrete sexual activity in Dreamwood, 1972. But after that, he didn't have to worry about the heavy hand of polite repression that existed before then. And he was able to make films later that he never could have made before. I mean, he could have made the films, but he couldn't have had them shown, or he couldn't have had them shipped. Well, producing Erogyny for me was extraordinarily easy. I had become the director of Pittsburgh Filmmakers in 1973, and one of the first things I did was to fill out an application to the National Endowment for the Arts for a grant for Pittsburgh Filmmakers. At that time, Pittsburgh Filmmakers was a small film club. It wasn't much of an organization. It had an annual budget of around $25,000 a year. It was totally focused on individuals who wanted to make films who lived in the immediate Pittsburgh area. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to establish Pittsburgh Filmmakers as a more significant organization. I even had dreams that it would become nationally important, which I was able to accomplish a few years later. But one of my first strategies was, when I applied to the National Endowment for a grant, I thought, well, I'm not going to ask for money to make films in Pittsburgh by Pittsburgh filmmakers, because they probably get applications like that from all kinds of organizations. I'm going to go for the fences. I'm going to try to hit a home run. I'm going to ask for money to bring two noted avant-garde filmmakers to Pittsburgh to make films here. So I asked for $4,500, which at that time was a relatively large grant, to fund the making of films by Bruce Bailey and James Broughton. Now, I was already a close friend of James and of Bruce. I asked them, would you be willing to accept the money if we got it? And James said, of course. So the application was approved, and we got a check for $4,500. There was a matching requirement that we would provide facilities for the people to work with, and some other additional monies. It happened that Sally Dixon had already got a $1,000 contribution from the Hunt Foundation that could be used as part of this package. So we had no difficulty getting the money. So I told James we had $2,400 or almost $3,000 for him to make a film if he wanted to in Pittsburgh. And he said yes. And he began contemplating what kind of projects he could embark on. His first idea was to make a film about orifices, the openings into the body from the nose, the mouth, the ears, and other areas that at that time would have still been relatively controversial and impolite to do. He realized that was going to be a problem, and he also realized he was sensitive to the fact that if he made such a film with money from the National Endowment for the Arts, it could backfire on the National Endowment. So instead of making a film about orifices, he made a film about the surfaces of the human body, a film where the principal verbal, poetic dimension was going to be the concept of touching. So he composed a poem about touching, and in 1975 he came to Pittsburgh, and with the assistance of the president of Pittsburgh Filmmakers, Robert Gaylor, and the money that Sally Dixon and I had provided, he shot for 2 days in Sally's house. A physical encounter of a man and a woman touching and caressing each other. He didn't quite know how it was going to cut together. He just decided he was going to shoot a lot of footage where this was done, where this touching and caressing was done, and then he would proceed to edit it afterwards. Turned out that editing the film was very difficult. He wrestled with it for almost a year before he figured out a way to do it. He succeeded, of course, and he made a very seductive, beautiful movie. And he premiered the film in Pittsburgh. And when the film was about to start, he said, by the way, he doesn't know it, but Robert Haller is listed as the producer of this film. And I sat up suddenly, and James said, he provided the money for the film. He didn't even know we were using his money. He never attempted to tell us what we should do. And in that sense, he was the ideal producer. Normally, when you have a producer, they hang around, they watch the shooting, they make suggestions, or whatever. But I didn't, because I wasn't aware of it. I didn't know I was the producer until the film started a minute later and ended 7 or 8 minutes later, and my name came up on the screen. Needless to say, I was delighted. First of all, because I was associated with James. Second, because I knew the endowment would not be agitated about the existence of this film, that it was a beautiful film. It was not in any way obscene. It's just the kind of film that couldn't have been made a decade or so earlier. Broughton dedicated the film to Willard Moss and Murray Menken for making Geography of the Body, which is an interesting comparison. They tried to make a film about bodily surfaces as well, but they made their film 2 decades earlier, and they were operating under the veil of the guillotine of censorship that could have fallen on them. So everything had to be metaphoric. You almost never saw human flesh in the film, or when you did see it, it was such an enormous enlargement that nobody could tell what it was. Like they photographed a nasal passage, but the nasal passage filled the whole screen, and it looked like Carlsbad Caverns or something gigantic. And this was all accompanied by poetry by George Barker, which was equally elusive and obscure and incomprehensible. Orogeny is a film that could be funded in the 1970s and 80s because the NEA was making, with great enthusiasm, grants to individual artists. And they made hundreds and hundreds of such grants. They also made hundreds of grants, dozens of grants to the American Film Institute that had a sub-granting program to more individuals. It was possible at that time for filmmakers to make films on any subject. However, some filmmakers made films that elicited cries of anguish and fury from Congress, specifically, I can't think of the man's name now, the man who made a crucifix in a jar of urine, and it was perceived as being a deliberate blasphemy because it was a crucifix, and the fact that it was beautiful, because the urine cast this wonderful golden light. I mean, if they hadn't said it was urine, everybody would have said, this is a marvelous film, we should give a copy to the Pope. But the word came out that it was urine, and at that point there was a hue and cry in Congress, and the whole idea of grants to individuals was killed by the congressional fiat. There was a whole series of restrictions placed on the National Endowment. So a film like Orogeny could no longer be made with NEA funds, not because of the subject matter, but because of the mechanics. You simply could not get a grant from the endowment to an individual. Now, if the film had been made under Anthology's sponsorship, not a re-grant, but literally a sponsorship, the film could have been made. But that kind of thing simply stopped happening. Anthology, I should say, is acutely conscious of the potential problems of this kind of an issue. So we have deliberately steered clear of seeking NEA funds, or indeed funds from the National Film Preservation Foundation, because they use NEA money, for films that could be deemed controversial. We can always go to Sony Entertainment or to other corporate sources to make films of controversial subjects or with controversial material, films that could be perceived as blasphemous or semi-obscene or whatever. We don't want to provide ammunition to the enemies of the National Endowment for the Arts. James was a gay filmmaker, but he didn't flaunt it. I mean, that's hard to believe, but in terms of the films that he made, up through Orogeny, certainly, his films were not stridently gay. They were often, they celebrated heterosexuality. The Bed, certainly, and Orogeny, and some of his other films. He was gay, but that didn't really become, it was never a problem. I mean, anybody who met him and knew him for a while could easily guess that. But he didn't shove that in your face. He was a filmmaker and a poet, and I don't think he would have liked to be pigeonholed as a gay filmmaker. Many gay filmmakers resisted that. Kenneth Anger said, I'm a filmmaker. Don't call me a gay filmmaker, because I'm a lot more than that. And that I think the same thing could be said of James. He was himself. He didn't want to be classified with other filmmakers, many of whom were not his equal. I haven't read all of James's poetry, but I enjoy it. His poetry usually rhymes. It's easy to like his poetry, and it has something in it that sometimes is hard to find in poetry. It's about something important. It may be flighty, it may be amusing, but beneath that level there's something else that is memorable. And that's what I like about his poetry. It has a serious ground on which something less serious is floating above it. But it's always easy to find the serious level. Now, could that serious level be found in his films? Certainly in many of them. I'd have to look at his filmography. Before he made Orogeny, he made charming films that are really quite wonderful. The Water Circle is a poetry film that is quite gripping. His film Testament is one of the most remarkable autobiographical films that I know of. After he made Orogeny, he made this film with Joel Singer called Together, this is not a negative comment. It is extraordinarily clever. You have two faces coming in from the opposite sides of the screen, finally merging. And I don't know how he did that film, because at this time, optical printing was just becoming readily accessible to filmmakers. I mean, Pittsburgh Filmmakers got its first optical printer, I think, 2 years earlier. Now, James may have had access to an optical printer before, but I don't know how he made that film unless it was planned in camera. And it could have been, because it's against the black background, and at least I assume it could have been. I'm not a filmmaker, so I can't speak authoritatively. Windowmobile left me completely confused. I could not figure out what the film was about. I mean, that's my memory. I suppose I might feel differently if I saw it now. The films that were made afterward tended to be much more overtly gay and much less interesting to me, because they weren't technically as extraordinary as his earlier films had been. The Water Circle was technically very impressive, and as I said, Together just knocked me out. I mean, I bought my own print of Together. I liked it so much. But James was not just making films at this point. He was also doing books. I mean, making light of it is wonderful. He did a terrific book about hermaphroditic experience that I thought was extraordinary. The Androgyne Journal, I think it was one of his most remarkable books when it came out, because it was something nobody expected. At least I didn't expect it. The Long Undressing was filled with wonderful anecdotes as well. James unloaded a lot of his most wonderful memories in the 1980s, which was really smart, because while he had his wits about him, he got it out, and that's what people should do. Memories are really important to get them out, and James left us with a huge store of them. Today, James Broughton, I think, is rather important because of the DVDs of his films which have been released by the Chicago organization, Facets Multimedia. That's actually very important. If you're an avant-garde filmmaker and you're living and you have a new film, it used to be at least that you could travel around the country and show the film to audiences. That's certainly what James did, that's what Brakhage did, that's what Hollis Frampton did. But the problem for them was, after they did that tour, people didn't want to were not inclined to rent their films unless they were teaching a class or doing some kind of a broad survey. Brakhage always complained to me that his films didn't get rented unless he was appearing in a city, and then they rented his films to show in that city. I know that happened with Frampton, except for college classes where people saw films in the context of a syllabus. The films did not get rented. Most of the films that are rented at the Filmmakers Co-op go to colleges where classes are taught. In the 1980s and 90s, independent, avant-garde, experimental independent films like those of James Broughton became available on VHS and more recently on DVD. I think this is extremely important. People can get the films, take them home, and look at them as they choose when they want to. And it's possible to study the films in a way that really wasn't possible before. And many filmmakers feel this way. I mean, Brakhage wanted people to look at his films on a screen, but eventually he relented and agreed to let the films be issued by Criterion. Jordan Belson doesn't want people to look at his films at all on screens, on projected screens, on film projection screens. He wants people to look at them on DVD because the DVD prints don't get scratched if they're treated halfway carefully. And they don't have to be replaced like the scratched 16 millimeter prints. So Jordan, I've had a lot of contact with Jordan about this. He says, don't show my film, don't project my films. Show my DVDs. He says, Anthology doesn't like to show DVDs. He says, they're wrong. DVDs are just as good or better than my film prints. And I'm sure James would feel the same way. I'm sure James does feel the same way because he's up there somewhere smiling and approving of this. Because that way James's films can survive. There's a tragic dimension to cinema, which is that films die. The colors fade, particularly since the demise of Kodachrome. Films get beat up and scratched, and unless there is a dedicated archive like Anthology that will make sure that new prints will be made from the immaculate original negatives or restored negatives, the films will become known more and more in their degraded condition. And I'm sure Broughton would be and is happy that his films can be seen on DVD the way they were supposed to be seen, with the proper color values, without scratches, at the right speed, and not at the hands of some stupid projectionist who doesn't realize when a film is over or stops the film because of some crazy reason and damages the film. Or a film that's going through a projector and the projector malfunctions, and then you suddenly have what appears to be the sun appearing in the middle of the film, and the frame burns out and it spreads. Even with safety film, you can burn holes in films. DVDs, that doesn't happen with. DVDs say cinema. I'm sure he was a huge influence on George and Mike Kuchar. When he taught filmmaking, it must have been a seismic event for his students to have Broughton there in person talking about how he did such a thing. And the way he would talk about it was always so amusing. I may have mentioned when he came to Pittsburgh repeatedly, he would teach seminars of experimental filmmaking. And he would show films by other people. He would show one film of his and 3 or 4 other films films by other filmmakers. And he had insight, and he shared an enthusiasm about the way the films had been made and what excited him about them, and that had a big impact on other people. I know he had an impact in Pittsburgh on people who were making films, who were just starting out to make films. I mean, in Pittsburgh, the two most inspirational filmmakers who taught classes were Gunvor Nelson and James Broughton. Gunvor was a very charismatic teacher, and so was James. Brakhage didn't teach filmmaking. He made films in Pittsburgh, but he wasn't as a teacher. It's accurate. He was a joyous man. I don't think I ever saw him depressed. I'm sure he was depressed, but he didn't show it to people. He was a constitutionally cheerful, positive human being who happened to be a wonderful poet and a wonderful filmmaker, and great fun to be around. It was great to have dinner with him. I suppose one way you could describe James was that he was a pixie who had somehow landed on Earth. A pixie,